All right, so welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today, we're diving into a pretty interesting question, one that's been making the rounds lately. Are men falling out of love with fiction?
Yeah.
We've got a whole bunch of sources for this one. Opinion pieces, some academic studies, news articles, even a little bit of psychology thrown in there.
The good mix.
Our mission is to figure out if this is actually a thing, a real phenomenon, and if so, what's behind it.
Right.
And most importantly, why should you care?
Yeah. And what's interesting here is we're not just talking about books gathering dust on shelves.
Right.
The sources seem to suggest that there might be some bigger implications here, for both individual men, but also society as a whole.
Yeah, and some of the numbers that we found were pretty eye-opening.
Oh, yeah.
The Reading Agency over in Britain, they found that more than a third of adults have just stopped reading for fun.
Wow.
And get this, that number jumps to almost half when you look at younger folks, those aged 16 to 24.
Really?
It makes you wonder, what's going on, right? Is it just that everybody's busy, or is there something more, something deeper at play?
Right.
I mean, think about it. If people aren't reading for pleasure, what are they doing instead?
Right. Exactly.
And how might that affect things like, their vocabulary or their ability to focus, even their understanding of other people?
Absolutely. Yeah. Those are all skills that you build by reading, even if you don't realize it.
Right.
The sources we've got, especially the analysis from the Book Trust and a bunch of the studies that they cite, seem to suggest that there's a real link between reading less and, this decline in these essential skills.
It's kind of a scary thought, right?
It is.
Like, imagine trying to get through a long article online or even a work email and you just can't focus.
I can't imagine.
Or you're in a conversation and you're totally missing the nuances, the emotions behind the words.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
So we've got this, potential decline in reading overall, but then there's this whole other layer to this deep dive, the gender gap. It seems like women are the ones driving the book sales, leading book clubs. They're even writing more of the books that are being published.
Interesting.
Some sources even go as far as to say that fiction is becoming, quote, feminized.
Wow, that's a provocative claim.
It is, right?
Yeah.
But it does make you wonder why this gap exists.
Right.
Are there social pressures at play? Are men being told, either directly or indirectly, that reading fiction just isn't for them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, a few of the sources offered up some possible explanations. For example, Jason Diamond wrote this piece in Dazed, where he talked about fiction being seen as kind of frivolous, maybe even impractical, in a world that's all about, hustle culture,
Yeah, Right.
That whole go-getter, always be grinding mentality.
Like, reading is a waste of time unless you're, learning how to make more money or build a business or whatever.
Exactly.
And that actually ties into another point that Diamond and the author of this Psychology Today article brought up, which is the rise of these manfluencers.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Those guys online who are pushing this very specific idea of what it means to be a man today. And a lot of it revolves around self-help and nonfiction.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And there's almost this unspoken message that fiction is for sissies.
Right. I get it.
We even saw that tweet from Andrew Tate where he straight up said, reading books is for cowards. I don't know if you agree with that, but it definitely got people talking.
It's a pretty extreme statement for sure.
Yeah.
But, whether or not you agree with Tate, it does seem like there's this undercurrent of pressure on men, right? To spend their time in ways that are seen as productive and, masculine, I guess.
Right.
And somehow reading fiction doesn't fit into that picture.
Exactly. And there's one other thing that Diamond and even Tate touched on, which is this idea that maybe the content of modern fiction itself just isn't resonating with men.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe the themes, the characters, the writing styles just aren't grabbing them the way they used to.
That's a really interesting point.
It is.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to dig into that further and see if there's any evidence to support that.
Right.
Are there certain genres or authors that are particularly popular with men? And if so, what is it about those works that appeals to them?
I think it's definitely something to consider. Diamond actually shared a personal story in his article about being a young guy who was super into hockey and punk rock, not exactly your typical bookworm.
Right.
But then he stumbled upon Catcher in the Rye, and it totally changed everything.
I love that story. It speaks to the power of finding the right book at the right time.
Yeah.
It's like a whole new world opens up.
Totally. He described it like a light bulb going off in his head. He went on to devour Kafka, Roth, all these other authors. He even said that getting into fiction probably saved his life, which might sound a little dramatic.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling of being completely transformed by a book.
Absolutely. And that's, what makes this whole conversation so important. It's not just about statistics and trends, right?
Right.
It's about the potential of fiction to impact lives, to open minds, to help us understand ourselves and the world around us better.
And that actually brings us to another interesting twist in all of this.
Okay.
Not all of the sources are buying into this whole men don't read fiction narrative. This Psychology Today article we found actually argues that fiction is like a mental and emotional cross-training.
Cross-training?
Yeah. And they've got a ton of research to back it up.
Interesting. I'm curious to hear more about this cross-training idea.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
Well, they cite all these studies that show how reading fiction can actually make you a better thinker. It helps you analyze information, see different sides of an issue, even strengthen your emotional vocabulary.
So it's not just about escaping into a story. It's about developing skills that can actually benefit you in real life.
Exactly. And they even bring up the work of this researcher named Keith Oatley, who's done a lot of work on the psychology of reading.
Okay.
And he's found that reading literary fiction in particular can help us understand different perspectives and navigate tricky social situations, which, let's face it, it's something we all struggle with from time to time.
Makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
Fiction allows you to step into someone else's shoes, see the world through their eyes, feel what they're feeling.
Right.
It's like a simulator for real-life interactions.
It's so true. It reminds me of something I read in The Guardian by Gabby Hinsliff. She was talking about how even those little stories that we consume on social media, like Instagram stories or whatever, are still tapping into our basic human need for narrative.
Yeah.
We're wired for stories.
We are. Stories are how we make sense of the world,
Right.
how we connect with each other, how we learn and grow.
Okay, so let's say we all agree that reading fiction is beneficial. The question is, how do we encourage more men to pick up a book and actually enjoy it?
Yeah, how do we do that?
The sources actually offered a few ideas.
Okay.
But before we dive into solutions, I think it's worth pausing for a moment and just asking ourselves how much of this perceived gap is actually real and how much of it is based on outdated stereotypes.
Right.
I mean, are we really seeing a mass exodus of men from the world of fiction, or are we simply noticing a shift in reading habits and preferences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the way we consume stories has definitely changed. Think about it. Podcasts, streaming services, video games, they're all telling stories in different ways.
Right.
Maybe it's less about men rejecting fiction altogether and more about exploring these new avenues.
That's a really good point. Maybe we need to broaden our definition of fiction beyond just books. But even so, I think it's worth exploring why this perception of a disconnect exists.
Agreed. And one of the things that really struck me as we were going through these sources is this idea that maybe some men are equating fiction with femininity.
Right.
That somehow reading novels or short stories is seen as, less manly than reading nonfiction or biographies.
Yeah, the Dazed article touched on that. Diamond even talked about how some men might be actively rejecting fiction as a way to assert their masculinity, which is kind of sad when you think about it.
It is, because if we're defining masculinity by what it isn't, then we're setting up these artificial boundaries, right?
Right.
That could be really limiting. It's like saying real men don't do this or real men only do that.
Right.
It creates a really narrow view of what it means to be a man.
And that's where those role models we talked about earlier become so important.
Yeah.
If young boys only see the men in their lives reading nonfiction, or maybe even making fun of people who enjoy fiction, then that sends a pretty powerful message.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It becomes this self-perpetuating cycle.
Right.
And that's why it's so crucial to challenge those assumptions and show boys that there are many different ways to be a man. And that enjoying fiction can actually be a sign of strength and intelligence.
Speaking of intelligence, the Psychology Today article made this really interesting point about how reading fiction can actually make you more socially and emotionally intelligent.
Oh, yeah, that was fascinating.
Yeah.
They were basically arguing that fiction is like a workout for your empathy muscles.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right? When you're immersed in a story, you're forced to see the world from another person's perspective, understand their motivations, feel their emotions. That's going to translate to real life in some way.
It does. There's a ton of research that shows a strong correlation between reading fiction and having higher levels of empathy and emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And those are skills that are just as valuable as any practical knowledge you might gain from a self-help book, maybe even more so.
I mean, think about it. In a world that feels increasingly divided and polarized, don't don't we need more empathy and understanding?
Absolutely.
Isn't that the key to bridging those divides and connecting with people who are different from us?
Absolutely. And fiction has this unique ability to, transport us into other worlds.
Yeah.
To introduce us to characters who are nothing like ourselves and help us see the world through their eyes. It's a powerful tool for building bridges and fostering empathy.
Okay, so let's say we're all on board with this idea that reading fiction is a good thing.
Okay.
The question is, how do we encourage more men to pick up a book and actually enjoy it?
Right.
The sources offered a few ideas.
Okay, I'm listening. Well, one thing that came up repeatedly was this need for better messaging, I guess.
Okay.
We need to move beyond this idea that fiction is just a form of escapism or entertainment.
Right.
We need to start emphasizing the real-world benefits, the ways in which reading fiction can make you, well, a better thinker, a better communicator, a more well-rounded human being.
Yeah, like maybe instead of marketing these books as beach reads or, guilty pleasures.
Yeah, exactly.
We should be talking about them as tools for like personal growth and development.
Exactly. And we need to highlight the voices of men who love fiction, who find it enriching and fulfilling.
Right.
Showcasing those positive role models can go a long way in challenging those outdated stereotypes about, reading being unmanly.
Right. I remember that Teen Vogue article actually had some great advice from educators about how to get students more engaged with reading.
Oh, yeah.
They talked about the importance of making it feel less like a chore and more like an adventure.
Right. I remember that.
Yeah.
They suggested things like incorporating quizzes or annotation exercises, which can help students, become more active readers.
Exactly. And they also talked about creating a culture of community around reading.
Oh, interesting.
Like, instead of just assigning books and expecting students to just read them in isolation, encourage them to discuss what they're reading with each other, debate different interpretations, share their thoughts and feelings.
It's about fostering that love of reading, that sense of discovery and connection,
Yeah.
That can really make a book come alive.
Right.
And I think that's something we can all do, regardless of whether we're students or educators.
Totally. We can join book clubs, we can start online discussions, even just have conversations with friends about what we're reading.
Yeah.
It all helps to make reading feel less like a solitary activity and more like a shared experience.
Absolutely. And that brings me to another point I think is really important. We need to make sure that men feel welcome in these spaces. Book clubs, literary events, online forums, they should be inclusive environments where men feel comfortable expressing themselves, sharing their love of fiction without fear of judgment.
That's a great point. We need to create a culture where it's cool for guys to, geek out about books, talk about their favorite authors.
Yeah.
Get excited about the power of stories.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the practical side of things.
Right.
We need to make sure that men have access to books that they'll actually enjoy reading.
Yeah.
That means diversifying our libraries and bookstores, promoting authors from a variety of backgrounds, recommending books that appeal to a wide range of interests.
So we're talking about everything from better messaging and role models to creating more inclusive spaces and making sure that there are books out there that actually resonate with men.
Right.
Sounds like there's a lot we can do to bridge this perceived gap.
There is. And it's not just about getting more men to read fiction.
Right.
It's about creating a culture where reading is valued, where it's seen as a source of strength and intelligence, and where everyone feels welcome to participate in the joy of storytelling.
Well said. Now, I know we've been talking about this in a pretty general sense, but I want to bring it back to you, our listener.
Yeah.
Have you noticed this men and fiction disconnect in your own life? Maybe you've seen it in your family, your workplace, your friend group. And if so, has this conversation sparked any ideas about what you might be able to do, even in small ways, to help bridge that gap?
It's something to think about.
It is. Now, we've covered a lot of ground today exploring the potential reasons behind this perceived disconnect and some ideas for what we can do moving forward.
It's a complex issue for sure.
It is. But I think one thing is clear. Stories matter.
Absolutely.
They shape how we see the world, how we connect with each other, how we understand ourselves. And if we want to create a more empathetic, more understanding, and more just world, then we need to make sure that everyone has access to the power of stories.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your ideas. Let's work together to create a world where stories are celebrated and where everyone feels welcome to participate in the joy of reading.
Well said. Thanks for having me on the Deep Dive. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been, unpacking this whole idea of a disconnect between men and fiction, exploring some of the possible reasons and even some potential solutions. But now I think it's time to really get to the heart of why this even matters.
Right, yeah. It's one thing to talk about statistics and trends.
Yeah.
But it's another thing to understand, what's really at stake here?
Right.
What are the potential consequences, for individuals, but also for society as a whole, if this trend actually continues?
Well, some of the sources we looked at painted a pretty, a pretty bleak picture. Gaby Hinsliff, for example. She wrote this piece in The Guardian where she talked about how, if we're not careful, books could end up becoming this niche interest enjoyed by just a select few.
Kind of like collecting vinyl records or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting analogy, and I think she makes a really important point about the impact this could have on kids.
On kids?
Yeah, reading aloud to children, especially in those early years, is so crucial for their development.
I mean, it makes sense. It helps them build vocabulary, understand language, even develop emotional bonds.
The Book Trust analysis actually found that reading for pleasure has a huge impact on a child's later success in school.
Really?
Yeah, it affects their vocabulary, their spelling, even their math skills.
Wow.
And for kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, being exposed to books early on can be a real game changer.
It's like giving them a head start in life.
Exactly. And it's not just about academics.
Right.
Reading also helps kids develop their imaginations, their empathy, their understanding of the world.
That's huge.
It is. Hinsliff argues that encouraging reading, both for kids and adults, is one of the most powerful things we can do to create a more equitable and just society.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah, it can improve social mobility, it can boost educational outcomes, it can even improve mental health.
It's like this ripple effect. This one simple act, reading, can have these far-reaching consequences.
Totally. And I think it all comes back to that idea we talked about earlier about fiction being like a workout for our empathy muscles.
Right. Because if we're not engaging with stories that challenge our assumptions, that expose us to different ways of thinking, then we risk becoming more isolated.
Yeah.
More entrenched in our own little bubbles.
Exactly. And that's what makes fiction such a powerful antidote to the polarization and the intolerance that we're seeing in the world today.
Yeah.
It allows us to step outside of ourselves, to connect with characters who are different from us, to experience the world through their eyes.
It's a good reminder that the world is this vast and complex place, filled with people who have their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes and dreams. And by engaging with those stories, we can cultivate a sense of empathy and compassion that is so essential for building a more just and equitable world.
Well said. Well said. And ultimately, I think that's what this whole conversation really boils down to. It's not just about getting more men to read fiction.
Right.
It's about recognizing the power of stories to connect us, to help us understand each other, to make us more empathetic and compassionate human beings.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, as we reach the end of our Deep Dive today, I want to leave you with this question. What kind of world do we want to live in? A world where books are, relegated to a dusty corner, or a world where they're celebrated as this vital source of knowledge, empathy, and connection?
Yeah.
The choice is ours, and it starts with each of us.
It does. So pick up a book, open your mind, let yourself be transported to a new world. You never know what you might discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little bit challenging. And who knows, maybe it even inspired you to pick up a good book. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.